Hari Om. So, session 15, chapter number 14, and this is about the threefold qualities. In other words, the three gunas, and this is called the yoga of the three gunas. And the whole point here is that we have seen in the last chapter that, the some yoga or the conjunction of Purusha and Prakriti brings about a certain experience in the individual. And if we can look at this experience through the lens of the gunas, then we begin to see that there is a way in which liberation can be attained through transcending the gunas. So this is what this chapter is about. Now, what we are going to first of all look at is the logic and the flow of thought so far, and a recap of what we have done up till now, the supreme knowledge, and how we can look at the pathway of perfection. And what Bhagwan talks about is this another way of looking at the supreme knowledge, but through slightly a different lens. And if then we go on to talk about the gunas and their nature, we will see how this pathway to perfection is possible through working on the gunas, and how each one of these gunas represents a certain kind of mood in our mind. What Gurudev says is the moods of the mind, which are related to the gunas and their nature, and how do we understand these gunas. How the gunas are actually functioning in the individual. So as we go about in our day-to-day transaction, we see that there are certain kind of dynamic changes taking place throughout the day. 1 minute we are up, next minute we are down, somewhere in the middle, sometimes we are very alert, and so on and so on. So these changing moods of the mind are described according to the functioning of the gunas, and that we'll see also how that is described. What then Bhagwan begins to talk about is how at the time of death, whichever guna is predominant, that becomes the way in which we are going to follow a certain pathway. And each guna which has a certain characteristics will also determine what happens after death. So that is also another important consideration to take place, to take into account, because then we are thinking about how do we live our life so that the life which we have lived will reflect itself in death, and therefore the consequences which will arise will be either beneficial or not beneficial according to how we have lived. Then the next part is about the one who transcends the gunas while embodied. This is the idea of Jivanmukta. The one who transcends the gunas is also the one who is described as the one who transcends Prakriti itself and establishes himself or herself in the true nature of Purusha. And this is the continuation of our thinking from the last chapter as well. Then Arjuna asked the question to Bhagwan about what is it to be this perfected one? Because we all want to know, how does this perfected one actually function in life? What does he experience? Is there anything which we can think about that will begin to create a picture in our mind? And as I've said before, that the Bhagavad Gita is full of these kind of perfected ones and pictures of these perfected ones. Right from chapter number 2, you remember Bhagwan talks about the Sthita Prajna Lakshana, the person who is perfected through that kind of establishment in the truth. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about somebody who has transcended the gunas, and what is this perfected one? What does he look like? What does he experience? And then, of course, we will talk about what we need to do as seekers of the truth, as to there is something, that's a lot of kind of practical things we can do in this chapter. And it is something very much connected to our lived experience on a day-to-day basis. So it provides a doorway to not only understanding this knowledge, but also to see how we can begin to apply this in our day-to-day life. So this is the scheme, and these are the themes which we are going to follow up in chapter number 14. So let's start with the first one, the logic and the flow of thought. So far, And here we have seen that in this final section, the third set of 6 chapters talks about the divine and the relationship between the human and the divine, Purusha and Prakriti. And chapter number 13, which was the previous chapter which we talked about, there is this switching of the channel, so that from the first 6 chapter, which talked about the human condition, the next 3 chapter talked about the divine, and the third set of 6 chapters talk about the relationship between the human and the divine. In this case, we are talking about how uh, the experience of the divine in the human can be our pathway towards perfection. And in this chapter, there is the description of the Prakriti as the play of the Gunas and being the unchanging in the changing Gunas. So there is a dynamic changing of the Gunas taking place, as we'll see today. And the unchanging within the changing. How do we get to the unchanging from the changing? And this is what this chapter is all about. In the next chapter, we'll see how Purushottam and the manifestation as Jiva, very interesting chapter as well, because it describes the upside down tree and how that becomes a representation of the creation, the whole process of creation and our place in that totality of creation. And it's another short chapter, but very good chapter to memorize and to be able to kind of chant it, because it is like a summary of all the Vedantic knowledge. And therefore, it is often chanted at the beginning of a meal as well. The divine and the devilish expressions. The next chapter will be talking about the divine state, egoistic state in chapter number 16. Again, how that relationship between the divine and the ego, the jiva, is being described so that we can begin to tease out the differences between the two things. The chapter number 17 is about the threefold faith, how the faith itself can be either sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic. See, the expression of the gunas doesn't stop in chapter number 14. It runs throughout the Bhagavad Gita, as I'll show, and then it goes into detail about some of these threefold things which exist according to the description of the gunas in the various aspects of our life, including food. How can we have sattvic food, rajasic food, and tamasic food, and what do we need to eat on a daily basis in order to kind of align our consciousness to the highest. And the last chapter, of course, is about liberation through renunciation. It is a culmination of everything, of the knowledge and the guidance, and what Arjun finally decides to do. So this is the kind of context in which we are going to talk about, just to make a note of where we are coming from and where we'll be proceeding from this chapter onwards. So references are there to the gunas previously, as we have seen right in chapter number 2, where Bhagwan says, the Vedas deal with the 3 attributes. And be you about these 3 gunas. Right from the very beginning, Bhagwan is saying, this is Prakriti playing as gunas in your life, in your body, mind, intellect. What you have to do, these 3 attributes, you have to go and transcend beyond them. Free yourself from the pairs of opposite, ever remain in sattva. Ever remain in sattva. This is an instruction. And this is also, again, kind of elaborated on in this chapter as well. Remain in sattva, freed from all thoughts of acquisition and preservation, and established in the self, established in that consciousness, which is an observing consciousness as a witness consciousness of whatever is happening in the body, mind, intellect. Then in chapter number 3, he also talks about the gunas. All actions are performed in all cases. Remember, not just a few cases, but all cases merely by the qualities in the gunas. Okay? And he whose mind is deluded by egoism thinks, I am the doer. Actually, it is just Prakriti doing its job. And then we get identified with whatever is happening in the Prakriti, and we say to ourselves, this is me, this is mine, I'm the doer, I'm the enjoyer. This mixing which takes place is the pathway towards bondage and towards going round and round the cycle of samsara. Then again in chapter number 3, he says, the divisions of the qualities and their function, and he who knows the gunas as the senses moving amongst the gunas as object is not attached. So first of all, it's about understanding that the gunas are playing within myself and the gunas are playing outside in the world as well. And therefore, this senses as gunas, moving in the gunas of the outside world as objects. If we understand this, we know the truth. Knowing the truth means we know the play of the gunas in the gunas. So going further in chapter number 7, deluded by these natures, states of things, and the Prakriti playing about, composed of the three gunas of Prakriti, all the world knows me not as the immutable and distinct from them. Here, what Bhagwan is saying, everything has got mixed up. And in our delusion, we think that we are the play of the gunas, and we forget about that which is immutable, that which is unchanging, and which is completely distinct from that. What Bhagwan is also pointing out, this delusion of mine, this is my delusion. He says, this is the one what I have created through Prakriti, and therefore this is my illusion in which all these things are taking place. Made up of the gunas, caused by the qualities, it's very difficult to cross over. As we know that gunas are very difficult to cross over. In a sense that what Bhagwan is saying is that once we get identified with the body, mind, intellect, once we have this ego individuality, to go beyond the ego individuality and to detach from the ongoings of the gunas, Prakriti, it is very difficult. But he says there is a way out. How is the way out? Take refuge in me, then alone you will cross over this illusion. So illusion is this idea that I'm this body, mind, intellect. This is the play of the gunas which is taking place. Bhagwan has said to us before, take refuge in me, you will be able to cross over. There are also references in chapter number 15 to 18, just I pointed out earlier on. And therefore the gunas and the idea of the gunas is throughout the Bhagavad Gita. Why? Because we are dealing with Prakriti and Purusha. And if, as long as we keep on talking about Prakriti in terms of our own individuality, we'll have to talk about the gunas. And in our day-to-day life, in our transactions, we also kind of come across these gunas as the play, dynamic interplay of the three gunas, and how we need to kind of look at them and say to ourselves, what can I do about this in order to attain liberation, in order to transcend the gunas? So here, what we have seen before, and this will be familiar to you now, absolute Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, which is unmanifest Purusha, in the play of Maya, which is the inherent power of Brahman, with that particular power, the totality of creation comes into being. So this is the cosmic Ishvara. This is now the Saguna Brahman, and it is manifest Prakriti. And we saw how this is Vibhuti and Vishwarupa, one in all in one. And then the next level of kind of separation is this individual Avtara, Saguna Brahman, but this is Bhagwan now. Okay, Bhagwan himself declares this in chapter number 4, if you remember. And this is manifest Bhagwan, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, all the kind of Trinity, all the gods of Trinity are then said to be individual Avtara, also Saguna Brahma, which we can observe and perceive. And of course, the fourth stage is the personal Jiva. This is the Amsha, the Adhyatma, which is now the manifest Jiva. The Jiva who is the doer, enjoyer, supporter, permitter, witness. Remember that from the last chapter. This is what we talked about in the previous chapter as well. So, and this is the descent of the Brahman into Prakriti, into humanity, and whatever purpose is to ascend back into Godhood, into the self. And this is what we need to do, is to make this differentiation between Kshetra, which is the field, body, mind, intellect, and the Kshetrajna, which is the knower of the field. And in this chapter, of course, we're going to focus on the Kshetra, because this is a field in which the gunas are playing. This is the manifest Jiva, in which I become the enjoyer, I become the doer. And in this case, I have to find out how I can ascend back into Godhood and come to know myself as the knower of the field rather than the field. And Bhagwan gives us the techniques for doing that. And again, to kind of go back to this idea of Brahman expressing itself in the perishable saguna as Adhyatma, Adhideva, Adhyajna, Karma, Adhibhuta. And this becomes the way in which we experience ourselves as to the various functionalities which are there in terms of individuality, sentiency. Yes, we are sentient. We can take control. We function in various different ways. There is movement which is taking place. My body, mind, intellect is made up of matter. This is the kind of scheme in which the Brahman begins to express itself in the individual jiva. In you and me, Brahman is expressing itself as all these five factors. And so the expression in the jiva is the sentiency, control, function, movement. And then if you look at how this is experienced in the body, mind, intellect, I am this jiva. This is the totality of all these experiences taking place. And I say to myself, I am this jiva. And because of ignorance, because I don't know what my true nature is, I begin to get identified as this I, and I want happiness out of my identification and the world of objects around me. What I'm seeking is happiness. So this becomes the way in which we live our life. And therefore the binding through the gunas begins to take place. It's already taken place by the time we get born, because we come with a load of vasanas, and these are begin to express themselves right from the very beginning. And what we then try to do, I want happiness out of this, that, and the other. And what this chapter is going to tell us is that where is this happiness coming from and what are we interested in? And that causes the binding, that causes the attachment through the various different gunas, the three gunas, in three different ways. And that results in this me and mine. I am the enjoyer, I'm the doer, and this is now our story. This is how you and me are functioning at the moment. Okay, so what Bhagwan is going to tell us how to get out of this particular identification and attachment, how to get out of the me and the mind by transcending the gunas. So here we go again. So here's the perishable saguna expression in the jiva, sentiency, control, function, movement, which is taking place, identification with the body, mind, intellect, and therefore binding takes place through the gunas. And what we have is me and mine. What is the way out? The way out is I have to unbind myself from the gunas through my sadhana and transcend the gunas ultimately to reach the imperishable Nirguna Brahman. So you can see this is now the process which has been described in the Bhagavad Gita by Bhagwan Shri Krishna, very kind of systematic way in which this is going to happen, and how we can individually begin to identify the gunas, know where the binding is taking place, begin to unbind by ourselves by the techniques which are given to us by Bhagwan. So let's go further now. And again, to remind ourselves, this is a kshetra. This is the body, mind, intellect, functioning as these 24 elements in the field, which is the kshetra. And here's Brahman, kshetrajna. And here's the connection between them. The modifications which are taking place in the body, mind, intellect, which will be described in this chapter as the functioning of the gunas. These are modifications taking place at the level of the body, mind, intellect. What we need to do is through our sadhana, we need to attain sattvification, purification. Again, very much related to this chapter whereby Bhagwan is telling us the gunas function in a certain way. So there is a predominance of one guna and the kind of subsuming of the other gunas because this one guna is predominant. Our sadhana is first of all making more and more of this sattvic guna available in our body, mind, intellect. And this comes through sadhana. And therefore, going further, in this chapter, number 13, Bhagwan had a slightly different way of getting to this purification, which was by cultivation of the qualities. And this was described as the means, the knowledge. And this cultivation of the qualities, if you remember, just to give you an example of how to know and be the knower of the field in the field. In other words, that how do we bring about more and more of the divine into our day-to-day experience through cultivation of these qualities. And you will notice that all these qualities, and we talked about that in the last chapter, all these qualities are kind of diminishing the ego, diminishing the me and the mind, taking the element of the ego in ego identification away from our experience and creating the room for that consciousness to shine through. This is now what Bhagwan is also going to describe to us in this chapter, but in a different way, looking through the lens of the gunas. Okay, so let's just think about the gunas in general. So gunas are the attributes of nature. Now, attributes of nature means the gunas don't exist outside nature. They are part and parcel of Prakriti, they're part and parcel of nature, and they determine the functioning of all the elements of nature, whether it is living or non-living. Whatever it is, the functioning of all these elements are determined by the gunas. And the gunas are attributes of the jiva and the body and the mind and the intellect, and functioning according the to their nature. And what happens is that the gunas are not only just in the totality of creation, but they are also reflected in this creation of the body, mind, intellect. And they function according to their nature. And the jiva experiences the function of the gunas as experiencing arises in the body, mind, intellect. So now if I ask you, what are you feeling in your body? What are you feeling in your mind? What are you feeling in your intellect? What is going on? What is the experience in the body, mind, intellect? What Bhagwan is saying, these are the play of the gunas which are taking place at all levels of our being. And this is me as the jiva experiencing the functioning of the gunas as the experiences continuously arise in my BMI. So awareness, activity, apathy are experienced through the play of the gunas. So we'll see what each one of these means. Awareness, sattva guna, activity, rajasic guna, apathy, which is the tamasic guna. And this we continue to experience in our day-to-day transactional life. So this is how the gunas then begin to function. And when these are functioning, what happens is the jiva becomes mistakenly identified with these experiences. Whatever is going on, I begin to own this experience and say to myself, right from the very beginning of our life, this is me. I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, I'm thinking about this is me, this is my thought. Mistakenly identified. Why? Because I have the non-apprehension of my truth about myself. Because I don't apprehend the truth about myself, I begin to mistakenly identify with all these experiences which are going on, and therefore become the doer and enjoyer of all these experiences. The human purpose then, according to this chapter again, is to attain liberation, but in this case, through the purification of the mind by doing what? Increasing the dominance of the sattva guna, and then to transcend the gunas altogether and establish ourselves in the truth. So here's the scheme. And this is how the gunas are related to the body, mind, intellect, our sense of who we are, how we mistakenly identify ourselves with whatever experience is going on. And we need to reverse this whole process by purification of the mind through predominance of the sattva guna. And then that allows us to find a stable ground from which we can jump into the transcend into the truth. So let's look at the first part of this chapter now, where Bhagwan says, I will again declare to you that supreme knowledge. So Bhagwan has said this several times. And supreme knowledge, as we know, is Brahma Vidya. It is the knowledge of the self. It is that knowledge which is not the secular knowledge about various different things, but it is the ultimate knowledge, which is described in all the Upanishads. And as we know that the Bhagavad Gita is the essence of all the Upanishads. So Bhagwan is going to declare to us the supreme knowledge, which is the knowledge of the self, Brahma Vidya. And why is he going to declare it again? Is because we need to listen to this knowledge, not only repeatedly of the same kind of way in which we think about it, but to look at it from various different angles. 360-degree angles whereby we look at this knowledge from this side, this side, this side, this side. And we get a three-dimensional view of the supreme knowledge. In this case, we are going to look at the supreme knowledge from the point of view of the Prakriti, and then transcending the Prakriti through this kind of way of understanding the Gunas to that supreme knowledge, the best of all knowledges. There is nothing beyond that. This is the ultimate knowledge, having known which all the sages have attained supreme perfection after this life. So having gone through this purification and reaching this supreme knowledge, supreme perfection, then there is nothing else to attain. They attain the highest. They who have taken refuge in this knowledge have attained to my being. When we have taken refuge in this knowledge, which means we become sthita prajna, we become established in this knowledge, then we attain the ultimate, which Bhagwan describes as my being, because Bhagwan is then identified with that ultimate knowledge. And therefore, when we attain that ultimate knowledge, we become one with that supreme knowledge, which is Brahman, which is nothing other than what Bhagwan is telling us here. They are neither born at the time of creation, they go beyond creation, and therefore they're not affected by whatever is going on in creation, nor are they disturbed at the time of dissolution. In fact, once you have transcended and established yourself in Brahman, you become the creator. You become the dissolver. Why? Because you are perfection itself. And you are not affected by anything which is going on in creation, nor are you affected by creation itself, nor the dissolution at the time when it takes place. Nothing disturbs because you've gone beyond. Okay? So this is what Bhagwan is telling us. And he says, how does this arise? My womb is this great Brahma, Mulla Prakriti, and in that I place the germ, consciousness. Now this should remind you about the conjunction between Kshetra and Kshetrajna, whereby this consciousness coming into conjunction with matter, matter and consciousness coming together, we have the explosion of creation. And this is now what Bhagwan is talking about here. I place the germ of consciousness in this Mula Prakriti, in Prakriti, from where the birth of all beings will take place. Whatever forms are produced, whatever form, remember, moving, non-moving, whatever forms are produced, he says, O Kaunteya, that they, in all the wombs whatsoever, the great Brahma is their womb. In other words, the Prakriti in which Bhagwan is putting this seed of consciousness, then arises all these different forms which we see right in front of us, including you and me. I am the seed giving father. In other words, what he's pointing out is that I'm the source of everything. Whatever you see, moving, non-moving, whatever form you see is being created out of this particular process. Conjunction of Purush Prakrita, like we saw in the last chapter, Kshetra, Kshetrajna, consciousness, matter. This is all kind of different ways of describing what is going on. What we need to understand is that we are also this composite, this conjunction between Purush and Prakriti. And therefore we need to find out how we can separate these two things out to know what we truly are. And that is the great purpose of what Bhagwan is telling us. This is the great purpose of our life, is to know our true self. So Bhagwan then goes on to explain the nature of the gunas. So here, the first guna is called sattva, which is purity. The second guna is called passion, rajas, and the third guna is tamas, inertia. Sattva, rajas, tamas. Purity, passion, inertia. And these are the attributes of nature. Remember, these are attributes of nature, but they also apply to our own matter, body, and the mind and the intellect. These qualities, the gunas, Almighty Arm, born of Prakriti, bind the indestructible embodied one. Very important to remember this. When these gunas are the ones which are born of Prakriti, it is as if, of course, the imperishable, indestructible cannot be bound, but as if it binds this embodied one into the body, mind, intellect, fast in the body. Fast in the body, of course, mind and intellect as well. He gets stuck, bound. And this is one of the other meanings of the guna, is it is like a rope, binding rope. So once the embodied one begins to experience the body, mind, intellect, it gets bound up in this limited way in the body, mind, intellect. It gets bound up in space, in time, in causality. So this is what happens, is that the gunas, the play of the gunas, makes the indestructible, the Brahman, embodied one, to be bound in this body, mind, intellect. So you can now imagine what the task is going to be, is to unbind ourselves, which I have already pointed out. So here we go again. So Brahman, these are the three ropes. And the imperishable, the indestructible one, the indestructible in Prakriti, the three gunas, the three ropes that bind, sattva, rajas, tamas, they bind the imperishable into I am this. This is now my immediate experience. As Brahman gets bound into this form of this body, mind, intellect, it binds this imperishable, which is here and now in this body, mind, intellect. I say to myself, I am this body, mind, intellect. This is me. This is mine. And therefore, this is the kind of scheme, this process which is taking place because of avidya, because of maya. Because of maya and avidya, I am this is me, this is mine. That is the net effect of this descent of Brahman into Prakriti. Consciousness arising in matter. This is the net effect. I am this is me, this is mine. And what we have to do, again, is unbind ourselves through the techniques given by Bhagwan and then transcend the gunas. So here's sattva. Of this sattva, which because of its stainlessness, now this is the description of each one of the gunas, which because of its stainlessness, purity, luminosity and healthy. It is luminous, it is healthy, unobstructive. It does not obstruct anything. And it is pure, it is stainless, without any stain, nirmala. And because it is without stain, it is pure, it is taken to be luminous, it is taken to be healthy. But it does bind. This is the important thing to remember. It does bind. How does it bind? It binds by attachment to happiness, attachment to knowledge. So all of you are here today because of your sattvic guna being predominant at this moment. What has made you to decide to come here? Because the predominance of the sattvic guna, which you say, I love this knowledge. I feel happy when I hear this knowledge. I want to hear it again and again. And this actually is one way of binding. Although this is a good way of binding. This is a good attachment to have, because this is the attachment which is going to take us further into our journey. So luminosity, healthiness, unobstructiveness, purity, this is what sattva represents, and it binds by happiness and the attachment to knowledge. The next one, rajas, of the nature of passion. Passion means this energy, this drive to get things, activity, thirst and attachment. There's this thirst. I want to do this. I want to get this. I want to get this thing done. I want to acquire this in my life. I want to have this in my life. There is a thirst in all of us, which is the expression of rajas. It wants us to go out into the world through action, through our passion, get things in our life. This thirst and attachment comes from this guna, and it says it binds fast by what? Attachment to action. So attachment to action means what? It means By doing things in this world, I will be getting something. By doing things in the world, I will be expressing my desire. When I express my desire, I will get the object of my desire. And I will become happy once I get this object of my desire. And once I become happy, I become attached to the object of my desire. See how wonderful Bhagavad Gita is in terms of understanding the psychology of the individual. So my next series of talks are going to be on this psychology of the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, so coming back to this idea that this passion which is there, this thirst which is there, which is pushing me to go out into the world of names and forms, that is the thirst, causes the attachment, and it is causing attachment through action. The third one, tamas, is born out of ignorance. I don't know, I don't want to know. Some people say, don't bother me, I don't want to know. That is a tamasic response. Deluding all embodied things. So it works at two levels. One is that it is completely making me unaware of my true nature. I don't even believe in spirituality. Forget about that. What I see is what I believe in. This is tamas. It deludes us into thinking that there is nothing beyond what I can see. There is nothing I can believe which can exist beyond what I perceive. This is the way in which tamas works. What does it do? It binds fast by heedlessness, indolence, and sleep. So it's just laziness, inadvertence, heedlessness, wants to be asleep, want to be sleeping all the time. Even in the waking state, asleep to the knowledge, asleep to the truth, asleep to the awareness which is shining there. I don't want to know. This is tamas. So you can see these three gunas are a way of expressing our attachment and the way in which we get attached. And at each level, we can see that attachment is to different things according to the play of the gunas. And what we need to do is to recognize all these things which are going on so that we can begin to identify the gunas. So here's the table. So I'll make it easy for you. Sattva guna, stainlessness, luminosity, healthy, binding through knowledge and happiness. Rajas, passion, thirst, attachment, binding through action again. Tamas, ignorance, heedlessness, indolence, sleep. So just keep that in mind because this is going to help you to analyze yourself to know where you are. Sattva attaches to happiness, rajas to action, while tamas verily shrouding knowledge. It is shrouding everything away and telling us there is nothing there. It attaches to heedlessness. In other words, don't even pay attention to anything. This is how the gunas are in their nature. This is how they function and how they bind us in our body, mind, intellect. Remember, the binding is taking place in the body, mind, intellect. And binding is about what? It's about identification and attachment, the me and the mind. This is the net result. And therefore, we have to try and travel back in the reverse direction by identifying the gunas and knowing what they are doing. So the next section is then going to tell us about how the gunas are functioning in the individual. Just 4 verses. When sattva arises, prevails, having overpowered rajas and inertia tamas, then now rajas arises, and what happens is that having overpowered sattva and inertia, and then tamas arises, having overpowered sattva and rajas. So this is how the gunas are functioning. And so what it means really is that the gunas are not all functioning together. There will be a predominant guna at any one time. Although they will be shifting very fast sometimes, the dynamic nature of Prakriti will make these gunas to become predominant very, very quickly sometimes. So that from sattva, we go immediately into rajas and into tamas, and then back again into sattva. You can actually follow this play of the gunas if you become the observer. This is our intention. We want to become aware of all this play of the gunas taking place in our body, mind, intellect. So through every gate in this body, the light of intelligence shines. Then it may be known as sattva. Sattva, which is now predominant. So what it is saying, how can I recognize when sattva is predominant? Because I can see this light of intelligence shines through all my senses. Not only the senses, but the mind and the intellect, of course, because that is what is lying behind the senses. What is light of intelligence? The light of intelligence is total awareness, total alertness, the ability to pay attention, single pointedness, stillness of the mind. This is what sattva brings when it is predominant, full of knowledge, full of awareness, full of light. And this is what Bhagwan is saying, light of intelligence. So not only is there knowledge, but there is awareness of whatever is going on in relationship to that knowledge. Then greed, activity, undertaking of actions, restlessness, longing, all these are from the Rajasic Guna when it is predominant. So when you start feeling, I need to do something, I need to do something, I want to undertake this action, I want to start something new, because I'm bored with all these things which are going on. I want to start something new. I want to undertake new actions. There is this restlessness within me. I feel so restless. I want to do something, do something. Rajasic Guna is predominant in this case. And then darkness, inertness, heedlessness, delusion. This is when the Tamasic Guna is predominant. I don't know and I don't want to know. I'm feeling as if I just want to get away from everything, escape from everything. I become heedless. I get fixed into delusion. When that kind of experiences arise in ourselves, what do we say? Tamas is predominant. So you can see a wonderful picture of how Bhagwan describes this experience and analyzing this experience in terms of the three gunas and how when one is predominant, what begins to happen in our experience. So here we go. So sattva, rajas, tamas, they kind of go about this way, that way, they begin to arise. Sattva is predominant, rajas is predominant, and so on and so on. So light of intelligence shines in rajas when it's predominant, greed, activity, undertaking of action, restlessness. Tamas when it's predominant, darkness, inertness, heedlessness, delusion. So keep this picture in your mind, because then whatever you're experiencing, you can tell yourself, yes, now it is rajas, it is tamas, it is the play of the gunas taking place in my body, mind, intellect. This is the dynamic interplay of all the gunas. So we now go to the next section, predominant guna at the time of death and the consequences of whatever the predominant guna is. We've come across this idea before, where Bhagwan says that, if at the end of your life, you remember the truth, you remember Bhagwan, you will travel towards the higher worlds. Krama Mukti. This is what Bhagwan is also describing in a slightly different way. Now he's going to describe to us in the context of the gunas. If the embodied one meets with death when sattva is predominant, then what happens? He attains the spotless worlds of the nodes of the highest. Nodes of the highest means right up to Brahmaloka, where the highest knowledge is available absolutely wonderfully. You travel in that direction. And of course, in between, there are also higher worlds where there are knowers of the truth to different degrees. But what it means is that you go upwards. And then meeting death in Rajas, what happens? He is born among those attached to action. Because we are now, thinking about action, we are continuously kind of trying to get something. We are attached to the things of the world. Through action, we begin to attain things, acquire things. And as we keep on doing this, what happens is that we get attached to action, and therefore we are born into that kind of family. And then dying in tamas is born into the womb of the senseless. So here what happens is that sattva, if it is predominant at the time of death, we go to the higher worlds. Rajas, we remain on the earthly plane, very likely. And then tamas, we go into the lower worlds. So now this is where we can think of, okay, I've got this human birth now, but I have, been in this predominant tamasic guna throughout my life, and therefore, even at the end of my life, it was this tamasic way of behaving. Somehow, it can even take us to the lower regions and the lower worlds. So, predominant, again, in a pictorial form, this is what happens. Sattva, worlds of the knowers; Rajas, world of action; Tamas, world of darkness. And upwards or downwards, we have the choice. We can actually choose which direction we want to go towards. Why? Because when we use our buddhi, when we use the knowledge and do our sadhana, our abhyas, we begin to move towards sattva, we begin to go to the higher worlds if we happen to pass away in this predominant guna. Again, something Bhagwan has talked about before, but in a different context. But here we are also talking about a similar thing, but from the lens of the gunas. So the fruit of good action, again, making something clearer to us in terms of death and its consequences. The fruit of good action is sattvic and pure. The fruit of rajas is pain, and the fruit of tamas is ignorance. So in other words, that when we are predominantly in a sattvic kind of guna, then we will be performing good actions. We will be going towards punya. We will be going towards purity and sattvification and purification. In rajas, what happens is that the outcome is really pain. Even if we try to get this, that, and the other, we try to hoard, we get attached, and we know what happens when there is attachment. Why? Because there is impermanence, there is transiency. We get dependent on these things. Remember the five lessons of life. This is what rajas is going to bring. Eventually, there is only pain because we are going to leave all these things behind, which we have been so engaged with, trying to acquire, trying to hoard. And the fruit of tamas is ignorance. Of course, it is ignorance because, the avidya, the ignorance is really what tamas is engaged in, because it doesn't want to know, it doesn't care, and it is completely devoid of any kind of movement towards knowledge, and therefore the fruit of tamas is ignorance. What arises from sattva? Knowledge again. Greed arises from rajas, and heedlessness, delusion, and also ignorance arise from tamas. Now, Bhagwan is telling us this. Why? Because he wants us to know and begin to think about how we can get towards the sattvic predominant life. And what is going to happen once we have a certain predominance of each of one of these gunas. So those who are abiding in sattva go upwards, just like we talked about before. Rajasic dwell in the middle, and tamasic abide in the function of the lowest guna. They now travel downwards. So important to understand that there is purusharth, there is choice which is available to us. There is this willingness to travel to the ultimate goal, which allows us to do sadhana and abhyas, and therefore we can definitely move towards a sattvic mode of being, and we can definitely move upwards into the realms which are the lokas above. And then, of course, we'll come down, but we can keep on climbing, climbing, climbing until we transcend all the gunas. So, fruit of the action in sattva is purity and knowledge, in rajas is pain and greed, in tamas is ignorance and delusion. So now we have to think about which direction we want to go. Direction is upwards, and this is going to come through purification. Remember, the other word for purification is sattvification, the sattva guna being predominant. We are interested in knowledge, the highest knowledge. We are interested in purification of the me and the mind from our consciousness. And this takes place through our sadhana. Now we go to the next section, which is going to talk about the one who transcends the guna while embodied. When the seer beholds no other agent other than the gunas, knows him who is higher than the gunas, and he then attains to my being. Now you can see the scheme here. You can see the logic which Bhagwan is pointing out to Arjun. First of all, the seer, which is this observing, witnessing consciousness, is seeing no other agent, which means I'm not the doer and I'm not the enjoyer. It is just the gunas which are playing about. And when I am identified with the knower of these gunas, in other words, the knower of the field, who is higher than the gunas, then he attains to my being. So what is the proposition here? Get out of the gunas, go into the witness consciousness, and then from there attain the highest, which is the Lord himself. So this is the proposition which Bhagwan is giving us here. The embodied one, having crossed beyond these gunas, out of which the body has evolved, is freed from birth, death, decay, and pain. Why? Because that belongs to the body, that belongs to Prakriti. He has gone beyond that. He has crossed beyond the gunas, effectively beyond Prakriti, and therefore attains to immortality. Mortality, body, which is subject to birth, death, decay, pain. Immortality, the seer, the ultimate truth. So you can see once we cross beyond the gunas, beyond Prakriti, beyond mortality, beyond the body, beyond birth, death, decay, and pain, we cross over to immortality. Moksha, complete liberation. This is now again what Bhagwan is pointing out, this supreme knowledge, wonderfully put here by Bhagwan in such a way that, it is so good to see how this is related to what we've been talking about before, but it gives us a different insight in terms of our experiences moment to moment. Final section is about Arjuna's question and Bhagwan's response about the perfected one who has transcended the gunas. So just to kind of go back one step, in chapter number 13, we saw the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti from 13:20 to 24, which was saying Purusha, seated in Prakriti, experiences the gunas born out of Prakriti. See how the link is between the last chapter and this chapter. So Bhagwan has taken this one particular verse and elaborated on these gunas. And what are the experiences which we are going to experience? He has already told us attachment, how it's going to develop, what is the way in which these gunas become predominant, and what happens when they become predominant. This is what Purusha, which is seated in Prakriti. Consciousness in matter, which is the conjunction which we have been talking about, that we are a conjunction of Purusha and Prakriti. At this time, we don't know Purusha at all. All we know is body, mind, intellect. This is me. This is what I'm called. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. This, that, and the other. We got totally identified with the experiences of the guna, born of Prakriti. But Purusha is seated here right now. And this attachment to the qualities is the cause of his birth in good and evil wombs. Once I get attached to these experiences which are going on, I say, I'm the doer of all these actions. I'm the enjoyer of all these various different things which are getting in my experience. I become attached to these qualities: happiness, knowledge, action, greed, heedlessness, delusion. And all this is because Purusha, seated in Prakriti, experiences all these things and gets bound to the body, mind, intellect, to Prakriti. And the Supreme Purusha in this body is also called the spectator, the permitter, the the supporter, the enjoyer, the great Lord, and the Supreme Self. Brahman is not out there somewhere. He's seated right here in you and me. Bhagwan is telling us, find that Purusha within yourself, whether you see him as the Bhokta, as the enjoyer of all these experiences, whether you see him as a supporter, the permitter, the spectator, the great Lord, the Supreme Self. Purusha is right here in this body. How to identify this? See, the wonderful knowledge of Bhagavad Gita brings you right down to your lived experience. It's not a high philosophy which is out there somewhere. It is here and now, practical in the way in Bhagwan tells us, do this, do this, do this, and you will experience the truth about yourself. He who thus knows the Purusha and Prakriti together with the Gunas, he, Bhagwan says, in whatever condition he may be, he is not born again. This is the promise of Bhagwan, is that when we know Purusha and Prakriti together, in other words, that I can identify this play of the Gunas taking place in the body, mind, intellect, at the same time I identify myself as this Purusha, this consciousness which is the seer, which is the spectator, the observer of whatever is going on. When I know both these things taking place simultaneously in my experience and can separate these two things apart, and I can say to myself, these are the Gunas, this is the play of Prakriti, this is Purusha, I am this consciousness, I'm the observer, I'm the witness, I'm the spectator of this play of the Gunas in myself and the play of Gunas in relationship to the world. If I get to this point, I have this supreme knowledge and therefore no coming back. Liberation. He is not born again because moksha, the purpose of life, has now been achieved. So what is the sadhana? Sadhana to know Kshetrajna, the Purusha. This we learned in the last chapter. Some by meditation, dhyana yoga, behold the self in the self by the self. Others by jnana yoga, sankhya yoga, which is the practice of shravanam, mananam, nididhyasanam, the contemplation on the highest knowledge, and then getting such a clarity about this knowledge that you can begin to tease these two things apart in the body, mind, intellect. And others by karma yoga. So Bhagwan has already told us, whichever your entry point is, from there you can start your journey. If you have not done any spirituality before in your previous lives or in this life, your starting point is karma yoga. Then bhakti yoga, which comes together with karma yoga. Then jnana yoga. Then dhyana yoga. And then establishing ourselves in the truth by beholding the self in the self by the self. So again, very clear idea about what the journey is, how do we get there, what are the different stages, purification and establishing ourselves in the knowledge through karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga. This becomes the way in which we carry out our sadhana and know the Purusha. So remember, it is about knowing the Purusha in this play of the Gunas. And this is what we are trying to think about, what is the best way of doing that, which Bhagwan is telling us. Others also not knowing this worship, Bhakti Yoga, have heard of it from others. They too cross beyond death because that is their starting point. They listen to others, they remember what others are telling them, they haven't read the scriptures or done anything, yet because they are listening to this highest knowledge, heard from others, eventually they also cross over because they have already stepped onto the spiritual pathway. As I've said before, Bhagwan has not left anybody out. He says, wherever you are in terms of your human condition, you can step onto the path one way or the other. And he sees who sees all actions are performed by Prakriti alone, and the self is actionless. Self is without an action. It is not the doer. It is not the enjoyer. It is Prakriti just playing about in itself. And therefore, Gunas playing in the Gunas is what we are experiencing, unfortunately, because of Maya, Because of avidya, we got identified with the body, mind, intellect. But when man, he who sees the whole variety of beings as resting in one, resting in that one reality, when all these forms are seen as all in one. Remember that concept before? All in one, spreading forth from that alone through the effect of Maya. Creation has been coming into existence with all this variety of beings. When we see this, resting in the one, which means we have kind of transcended and we are witnessing all these things which are going on, spreading forth from that one alone, he becomes Brahman. Supreme knowledge attained how? By separation, witnessing, by separation of Purush Prakriti. And when we abide in the Purusha as the witnesser, as the Upadrashta, as we mentioned in the last chapter, then one becomes Brahman. So this is now Arjuna asked this question. What are the marks of the one who has crossed over the gunas, O Lord? What is his conduct? Question number 2. Question number 3. How does he go beyond the gunas? 3 questions Arjuna is asking. So the Lord replies, activity, light, delusion, when present, O Pandava, he hates not, nor longs for them when they are absent. Here's the first instruction. What Bhagwan is describing is the perfected one. What are the characteristics of the perfected one? Just like in chapter number 2, Sthita Prajna, the perfected one in that case. Here, perfected one who has transcended the gunas. In relationship to gunas, perfected one means what? It means that whatever is going on in our body, mind, intellect, if these are absent or present, whether it is light, sattva, rajas, activity, tamas, delusion, he doesn't hate them. Because if you start hating, oh my God, I've gone back into rajas. Oh my God, I've gone back into tamas. Then you got a double problem. First of all, you got the gunas playing there, and then you compound it by hating it, which means that you're not really moving in the right direction. What you have to do, samatvam, stay steadily, just as an observer. You don't hate, nor do you long for them if they are absent. So this is the first thing which Bhagwan is telling Arjuna. Seated like one unconcerned, udasin, upadrashta, just the observer, not concerned with whatever is going on in the body, mind, intellect, this play of the gunas which are taking place, unconcerned. Very high state of spiritual development, which is about, here are the gunas which are going on. How can I then begin to look at these gunas and say to myself, I am unconcerned. Whether they're there or not there, I am unconcerned. Not moved by the gunas, who knowing that gunas operate is self-centered and serves not. Not self-centered in the egoistic sense, but centered in the self. Centered in the self means centered in the awareness, centered in the consciousness, as apart from what is going on in that awareness. So, separating out the content of awareness from the awareness itself. And you become the awareness which is just observing whatever is going on. So when I center myself in that awareness, I don't move about, I don't swerve about. I become unconcerned, udasin. Then the next set of things, alike in pleasure and pain. Whether pain is there, pleasure is then alike. This is what I told you before about the horizontalization of experience, neutralization of all these experiences through this sense of equipoise, samatvam, alike in pleasure and pain, who dwells in the self, again in that center of awareness, to whom a clod of earth, precious stone, gold are alike. In other words, his judgment about the things outside, he doesn't value, because value that comes from the vasanas. The vasanas tells me, oh, I like this, I want to go after this. This is like gold. I like gold because it is precious. It is valuable to me. When the vasanas are not there, what becomes this horizontalization of value judgment of all these things, and therefore equanimity. Then, to whom the dear and the not dear are the same. Those who are dear, not dear, doesn't matter. The same kind of centeredness in the self, which is a sense of equanimity about dear and not dear. Firm, firm in wherever you are, centered in the self, and same in censure and praise, and same in honor and dishonor, same to friend and foe, abandoning all undertakings. Nothing new is being undertaken. He is said to have crossed beyond the gunas. So you can see this separation has taken place. The gunas are left by themselves doing what they want to see. I just become the udasin. I just observe and I see whatever is going on and I become unconcerned. In this center of myself, there is complete equanimity. There is complete calmness and peace. And there is complete silence. This is when one has crossed beyond the gunas. So centered in the self, again, to kind of make it in this pictorial way, level of the body, level of the mind, level of the intellect, all these are taken care of, equal-minded, sama, tulya. And this is what we have to try and do in our day-to-day transactions, is that we become centered in the self, non-attachment, aversion to the gunas, equal-minded in all these aspects of our body, mind, intellect, not initiating any further egocentric activities, centered in the self, non-judgmental, non-reactive, non-active. Now, some people might say, but then what happens to this body, mind, intellect? Is it just going to just lie there like a stone? No. Bhagwan has also given the solution to that. He said, this perfected one, what does he do? He lives only serving him, only devoted to him. This is what Bhagwan has already told us in chapter number 2, that this person of perfection is only concerned with the welfare of humanity. Just like Bhagwan comes into humanity for the upliftment of humanity, this person of perfection is in humanity, serving humanity, raising humanity into the higher consciousness by doing what? By serving him. Serving the Lord is serving society. Serving the Lord is to be in the service of others, to uplift others through whatever means we can, and just to be devoted to him. So this is the means of perfection. What is the means of perfection? By serving the Lord with unserving devotion, having crossed beyond the gunas, he is fit to become Brahman. So this is the means of perfection. And Bhagwan says, I am the abode of Brahman, the immortal, the immutable, and everlasting Dharma, absolute bliss. So when Bhagwan says, when you transcend the gunas, you will come to me, Bhagwan is saying, I am also the abode of Brahman. Not I'm also abode. I am the abode of Brahman. I am that immortal, immutable, everlasting Dharma. Consciousness, existence, bliss. Absolute. All these are absolutes which are available in Brahman. Beyond time, beyond space, beyond causality, beyond Prakriti, beyond the gunas. And that is our enterprise. In our life, if we want to go towards perfection, that is the way in which we're going to do it. So again, reminding you of the conscious spiritual living, how to go about it, the 4 A's of conscious living, the 4 B's of learning about and letting go, especially in relationship to the gunas, and then the 4 C's, clarity about whatever we have been talking about, comprehension, conviction, commitment, and the 4 D's, which are helpful to our sadhana, determination, devotion, dedication, discipline. Conscious spiritual living. This is what we want to get to, and this is a good framework to keep us going and to keep us focused on our spiritual pathway. So what are we going to do? Listen, read, reflect on the content of chapter number 14, the yoga of threefold qualities. Ensure that you understand how the gunas operate, function in your mind, in your life. Prepare a plan to practice the techniques given in this chapter and continue with the practices for the next month. Become equal-minded in all things. Try to practice this. Equal-minded, samatvam bhava, not to get concerned, just stepping away from the udasin, becoming the upadrashta, becoming the observer of whatever is going on towards all things, and becoming the impartial observer. Keep on doing this, you will get it. And when you get it, it's an absolutely wonderful experience to be able to sit and to stand back and to stay centered in the self and observe whatever is going on, at the same time to be able to do our service, our seva in the right way. Seva and bhakti. This is the technique Bhagwan is giving us as well. So remember those two things as well. Work selflessly, dharmically for the greatest good with devotion to Bhagwan in all your transactions. It's a certain way of living now. When you step onto this path, this is the way in which we are going to reshape our life, restructure our life. And Bhagwan says, serve me, become devoted to me. Let's work towards that. And continue practice all the other techniques from the previous chapters and prepare and execute daily intensified plan of meditation, which I've said again and again, very good way of sattvification, purification. If you make it a regular practice, you will see the difference in your life. So meditation on a daily basis, and then enjoy the sadhana, stay safe, stay well. We are soon coming out of the lockdown. So maybe next time we might, not the next time, but this time after that, we might kind of see some of you personally. Thank you and Hari Om. So now I'm going to ask Jayashree to say the prayers, and then we'll go to Rupesh and Bhargav. So Rupesh and Bhargav are great sevaks of Chinmaya Mission, and they're going to explain to us the new project at Chinmaya Kirti, and they're going to tell us how we can serve. Just like we've been talking about, service to society is service to the Lord. How can we do that? How can each one of us become an instrument to serve the Lord in this kind of way? So before they come on board, Jayashree will do the closing prayers.
Yes, Hari Om, thank you. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayah Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukha Bhag Bhavet Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurma Mritam Gamaya Om Purnamida Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om